ballots.
Well,
Yeah, quite like the ballots, I
Ballots.
think.
Yeah.
like
Yep. Should be good.
thanks.
Phew.
I'm sharing this. Forgive the informality of these remarks. We all know each other. We all know who's debating. Hopefully you both know what the resolution is. You all know each other. So without further ado, I call upon the first speaker of the proposition.
Thank you, Chair. Honorable panel of judges. The conflict between Russia and Georgia started somewhere between the Soviet Union falling apart and Georgia in 1991 declaring its independence as a sovereign country. Now, that conflict reached its pinnacle when more than 10,000 Russian troops, when more than 100 bombers marched into Georgian capital and invaded the Georgian nation. What side proposition would like to advocate today that it's about time that we do something? It's about time that we admit Georgia into NATO. Now, our team line today is simple. What we would say is that Georgia needs NATO and that NATO needs Georgia. And furthermore, what we would say is that the world itself needs this alliance to
On that point,
happen,
sir.
needs Georgia in NATO. Now, before we start with our major points of analysis, I would just like to add a little clarity to this debate by providing a few definitions. Now, NATO, as you all know, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that consists of 26 countries that have joined together for military cooperation, for military protection. Now, we want to dismantle the assumption right here and right now that the USA is the puppet master of NATO. What side proposition today believes that NATO is indeed an alliance in its purest form, meaning that USA is not the puppet master and does not control all the actions that NATO takes in itself.
On that point, sir.
No, thank you, madam. Now, our policy today is simple. We say that we should admit Georgia into NATO, taking effect immediately, meaning that if you propose this motion today, Georgia would be in NATO tomorrow. Now,
Point of information.
yes, madam.
What incentive does NATO have to admit Georgia?
Thank you. That is a brilliant introduction to our line of argumentation. I would like to argue in my speech two major points: why Georgia needs NATO and why NATO needs Georgia. And then Anya will talk about how the world does indeed need this alliance. So when talking about why Georgia needs NATO, when Russia invaded Georgia as it did by storming countless troops into its capital, we say that we as the international community condemned that action. But the problem here is that we do not really have the jurisdiction to act, to go in, to take control of the situation. And that is exactly what the admittance of Georgia and NATO would do. Because according to the NATO Charter, countries within NATO in itself have the right to defend each other, have the right to defend against hostile invasions, as is the case with Russia invading Georgia.
On that point,
No,
sir.
thank you, madam. And furthermore, what we would say is that by allowing Georgia to go into NATO, we would be able to take control of the situation, because the matter of the fact is Georgia needs help. When we have a superpower such as Russia storming in with its entire army, almost its entire army, we cannot expect Georgia as a tiny country to actually defend itself against such a vast force as is Russia. We would say on side proposition that because Georgia has been so cooperative in every way with NATO, with the West, that it is our responsibility to do something. It is our responsibility to go in and actually allow the Georgian nation as such to coexist
Point
with
of
NATO.
information.
No, thank you, madam. basically, what we want to say in this argument is that because Georgia needs NATO, because Georgia needs our help, we would say that that is a reason that falls to side proposition today, and that is a reason that we should indeed admit Georgia to NATO. Now, moving on to our second major point of analysis, why NATO does indeed need Georgia. Now, I would like to talk about 2 points here, that by actually admitting Georgia to NATO, we would be establishing our presence there, and secondly, by doing so, we would be making it easier for us to gain more allies, to gain more members, and furthermore, why is gaining more members crucial and actually has a positive effect? So firstly, establishing our presence by Georgia actually being admitted to NATO, NATO would have military bases, military operations, and other facilities in Georgia itself. Now, we say that that is a good thing because by having military operations in the heart of Asia, we say that we would be more capable, we would be able to react faster to crises that would happen in that area. And furthermore, what we would say is that by actually having those bases there, by actually ensuring that NATO troops are constantly there, that would be a sort of regional stabilizer, to put it as such. That would ensure, just a second sir, that would ensure that the stability would be reached. Yes?
Georgia can't even provide military in its own country. How can it provide military for other countries in NATO when it's in need?
Okay, the fact that it can provide troops is just a blatant lie. We see Georgia contributing the most troops to the war in Iraq, for example. We see Georgia having enough troops, so we don't really see that as a reason against Georgia joining the NATO, just because it might not be able to provide as many troops as it could, because we see the precedent here that basically establishing our presence takes over any technicalities that side opposition today would like to bring. Now, the second thing I would like to talk about in this major point is that how allowing us to basically admit Georgia to NATO would allow us to have more allies and actually create more alliances in that region. Now, what we would say is that basically Georgia joining NATO would be an incentive for other countries in the heart of Asia to actually pursue the goal of actually joining NATO in itself. Now, we see that as a good thing because one more country in NATO means a lesser chance of war, means a lesser chance of invasion, because when we have many countries in one conjoined group, as is NATO, we see the chance of actual invasions, of actual wars decrease, because what we say is that when a country knows that if it will invade something like Georgia, a country that is in NATO, we say that that would be a deterrent for it to actually not to. We say that would be a deterrent for these countries to actually not go to war and taking precedent over that. And furthermore, what we would say is that because of this decrease in the chance, we would say that that is a good thing, because having less war, having less invasions is something I think both sides can agree today is something good. And therefore, if we have proven, which we did, that this decrease would actually happen, we say that that is reason enough to accept Georgia in NATO as such. So basically, what this debate boils down to for side government in our first speech is that we need to admit Georgia to NATO because it needs us just as much that we need Georgia, and that is something that is the core of this debate, and that is the reason we want to propose.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 4 seconds.
I thank the first member of the proposition and call upon the first member of the opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are the captain of the dodgeball team. Ahead of you is a lineup of students. The question is, do you pick the debater? Most people would say no. In fact, maybe picking someone who plays football or someone who plays basketball would be a better choice. But just like that debater, Team Slovenia has dropped the ball. They haven't shown you how we are actually going to admit Georgia into NATO forces if there is no incentive for NATO to offer them a slot on the team. So in fact, ladies and gentlemen, in response to today's motion, this House would admit Georgia to NATO, the United States would offer the team line of avoid impractical actions by denying Georgian admission. On the team line of the United States, I will first start by talking about avoiding the Cold War, the sequel. Then I will address the point, avoid a one-way street, while my colleague Julia will discuss the point of avoiding situations that lead to poor military consequences. So therefore, let's first begin by looking at Team Slovenia's arguments. Their plan is a little inadequate, ladies and gentlemen. They first talk about how NATO is an alliance, but what they fail to tell you is the creation of NATO. NATO was in fact established at the close of World War II as a counter to the Warsaw Pact. So in fact, the very creation of NATO puts it as counter to Russian troops. This becomes very important in the world today, ladies and gentlemen, as Russia is once again trying to operate its sphere of influences. But Team Slovenia also seems a little bit paranoid about the fact of the US puppet master. And maybe that's warranted based on the fact that the United States is providing the most troops and technology to NATO. So therefore, I think that there is a debate that can be made about the true motives of NATO and the US influence in those decisions. But the biggest thing that Team Proposition fails to tell you is that we can't simply have an international vote of who should be included in NATO. In fact, that's kind of a silly question. NATO is the only group that can decide who is part of NATO. And in fact, when Team Proposition tells you that it's better for Georgia or that it's better for the international sphere, that's completely irrelevant because it doesn't matter to NATO if it's better for the international world as long as it's not okay for NATO. So in fact, the only consequence in today's round is whether this is good for NATO troops. So now let's look to their arguments in specific. Their first point is why Georgia needs NATO. But remember, it doesn't really matter to NATO if Georgia needs them. In fact, NATO is going to do what's best for NATO because it is a self-interested group.
But sir, madam, but
Oh, pardon the gender confusion, yes.
but we see that this is in NATO's best interest, as explained in our second major argument when we talk about how it would be indeed establishing its presence there.
That's fine, you're jumping the gun. I'll get there after I finish your first point. But as I would say, even if you think that we should care about why Georgia needs NATO, the reason why is that the Team Slovenia would tell you that NATO is allowing justification, that we need a right to defense, that we have to have the NATO troops come in and save the Georgians. But remember, what they're justifying is direct US, NATO, Russian conflict. What they are advocating is a return to the Cold War status. They're justifying one of the largest militaries in the world going against a coalition of another group of largest militaries in the world. So in fact, rather than creating solutions, we're creating further problems and further conflict. But he also admits to you that Georgia is a tiny country that can't fend for itself. But the problem with that is later that NATO then has no incentive to offer Georgia a spot on the roster because they can't fend for themselves and because they can't contribute anything to NATO. No, thank you, ma'am. But now let's look to the second point, which is the only point that even matters in today's debate round from Team Proposition. Their first argument under the second point is that they're going to establish a presence in Georgia in the region of Asia. They're going to say that they're going to have military bases in Georgia. He then tells you that Georgia has the most troops in Iraq. Well, there's two things wrong with this. One, that's simply not true. If you listened to the news, you'd understand that the United States, in fact, has the most troops in Iraq. But second of all, it is because Georgia has troops in Iraq that leads to another problem. And this problem is the problem of overstretch. Georgia is a small nation with a small military. Because of its involvement in other foreign conflicts, it simply doesn't have the resources to be able to put troops in other conflicts that NATO would back. So in fact, NATO doesn't have very many options when it comes to using its military because of the small number of these presence. But now let's look at the second warrant as offered by Proposition. They tell you that we're going to gain more allies. They tell you that there's going to be an incentive for other countries to join NATO, and there'll be a lesser chance of war and invasion. But actually what they're doing is they're expanding spheres of influence. Once again, they're creating a Cold War scenario wherein the NATO and Russian troops would be directly hitting heads, and actually what we're going to have is an escalation of conflict. The Proposition must live in an idealist world if they simply cannot understand that if we put NATO forces in Georgia, which is on the direct border of Russia, that there will be no conflict. Yes, sir.
You are simply asserting the fact that we're leading this world to another Cold War. Would you care to explain
That's
that
an excellent segue, because that brings me right into the opposition's case for today. Remember, the first point offered by the opposition is that we should avoid Cold War the sequel. The reasons why, if we put troops in Georgia, that we would lead to a Cold War is, one, we don't poke the grumpy bear. The bear being Russia in this scenario. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've listened to the news in the last couple of weeks, you've seen the Russian reaction to the missile defense system the United States has put in Poland. You've seen such things as Russians refusing to allow the British Language Institute to operate in Moscow any longer. You've seen Russians' insistence to promote their own self-power in the world. Russia is once again testing its strength. Ladies and gentlemen, why would we give them the opportunity to use their military? Why would we give them the opportunity to test their strength on the international sphere by creating a conflict in a border state of Georgia? Ladies and gentlemen, the impact of putting NATO troops in Georgia is such that we're going to have essentially an escalated conflict. No, thank you, sir. Russia has seemed to be embarrassed over the collapse of the USSR, and in fact the economic downturn that has since followed. But ladies and gentlemen, Russia does not want to be embarrassed anymore. Russia is keen to prove itself on the international sphere. So why would we give it the opportunity to show its military strength, to show the benefits that have been offered by the economic growth? In fact, the Cold War last time only very nearly missed a nuclear war. Why would we want to put ourselves in that dangerous situation again? Why would we give them the incentive to start a conflict? But now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look to the second point of the opposition, which is to avoid the one-way street. We've already told you that Georgia is a very small country. In fact, a very small country with a GDP of only $2,840 per capita. They have a small military, already overstretched in Iraq, already overstretched in dealing with the troops in South Ossetia. So why would we want them to become our allies? We don't want allies with a country that can't actually offer us anything. There's no incentive for NATO to admit Georgia into NATO, and in fact, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is whether NATO would actually admit them into the organization. Because, ladies and gentlemen, proposition has never even shown you that this is a viable option for NATO. And ladies and gentlemen, if you are a very good captain of the dodgeball team, you know better than to pick the debater, and you pick someone who can actually play the game.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 55 seconds.
I thank the first member of the opposition call upon the second member to follow.
As a smart member of any team, you pick the person that would be able to cooperate, the person that knows how to strategize. You do not pick a big, grumpy, football player with peanuts for brains who just grumbles there and says, I'm strong, nothing is going to move it, and if you say anything against me, I'm going to punch your face in. Well, the side of the government is not afraid of that. The side of government doesn't want to play the game Russia said so, so we're going to jump. And the side of the government is the one that is trying to protect the Georgians, the one that is trying to establish a stable area in the ex-USSR members, a stable area in this vital part of Asia. And if this means that we would have to poke Russia, so be it. And besides, on the point of the Russians mining so much, the United States troops are already in Georgia, and the Russians are not launching nuclear missiles towards them. So their whole point about starting a nuclear war, which was their first argument, fails on it. The USA troops are already in Georgia. The European Union is already trying to penalize Russia because of Georgia, and we are not amidst a nuclear war. Otherwise, ladies and gentlemen, I would believe that we would all heard of it and know it. So all the consequences, all the apocalyptic cases of the Cold War II scenarios simply fail on this point. And as for their second argument, which was that we should avoid a one-way route, ladies and gentlemen, the number of troops and the number of money absolutely isn't everything when you're trying to make an alliance. Strategical positions, which were so wonderfully explained by our first speaker, matter a lot in which every kind of military strategist can clearly tell you. It doesn't matter that the hill isn't made of gold. If it's high enough for you to shoot from it to get the enemy, you will conquer that hill. No, thank you, sir. And as for maybe the other concept, they were also speaking that Georgia is so small and so puny that the NATO simply shouldn't bother it. Well, I'm from a country, Slovenia is a country of only 2 million and maybe, I don't know, 2,000 soldiers, maybe a bit more, but not quite a lot more, and we are still in NATO. We are still an equal member of the NATO team. We are still contributing our troops. We are still continuing our funding, just a moment, sir, and nobody tells us simply to get off because you are too small. And through this example of Slovenia, I have clearly proven to you that size sometimes doesn't matter. Yes, sir.
You said that we're still contributing our troops. However, when Georgia has troops in Iraq and they don't have a small...
Oh, thank you, thank you. Georgia has been contributing troops to NATO missions throughout its time as an independent country. Georgia has been trying to reach towards the West. Georgia has been trying to help us. And how are we going to reward us? Simply use it or lose it. The side of the government clearly disagrees with this kind of an option and clearly agrees that when Georgia is in dire need, when Georgia is being invaded by Russia, we should reward it for her contribution to our means, to our fighting, with the protection, and through the protection, with the membership of NATO. And as for the consequences and the benefits for the NATO itself, our whole second argument of the government has been dedicated to it why NATO needs Georgia, in which I will repeat now. We have been speaking about the importance of the strategic position, and we have been speaking about there being less war if you have a lot of members in one organization. Let me simply put it like that. If we would have every single country in Europe, in Asia, in America, inside NATO, if all the countries would be cooperating, we wouldn't have any war. We wouldn't have no, thank you, madam. We wouldn't have those countries fighting amongst each other. So it is in our interest to get as many members in member states inside the NATO, simply because the more the members of the NATO, the less the fighting, the greater the stability. And this brings me exactly to our furthering of the governmental line, which is the point of why the word, no, thank you, madam, why the word needs this alliance between Georgia and the NATO troops. Let me take you a bit back in history, as Jean has already done. After the fall of the USSR, there was a big problem with the ex-satellite states or the ex-USSR states. We were having a bit of a crisis. The countries that were newly independent didn't want to be with Russia anymore, but on the other hand, didn't want to be the West anymore or weren't accepted by the West. This is why we had so many crises in this area of the ex-USSR. This is why we had so many dictators, so many unrest, so many instability in such an area. Because the West didn't want them, and then they didn't want to be Russia anymore. With accepting Georgia into the NATO, we are holding out a hand to the whole region, not only to Russia, but to the whole region. We are saying, okay, we agree, you are a newly formed country, we agree with you, we appreciate your cooperation with us, and if something goes wrong, if Russia wants to attack you, we are going to reach out a hand, grab you and pull you out of this danger. And this is going to incentivize other countries in this area, because, ladies and gentlemen, in this area it isn't only Georgia, but it's a numerous amount of countries that were and still are under the influence of Russia. We're going to hold up just a moment, madam, hold a hand and tell them, if you're going to have peace, if you're going to try to walk with us, we are going to protect you against your enemies, and we are going to give you the one thing you most desire: stability, cooperation, and peace. Yes, ma'am.
You keep telling us that there's incentives for other countries to join, but as so far, Georgia's the only state in that region to have shown interest in joining NATO. So where are these imaginary states coming from that you keep talking about that want to join NATO?
Georgia is interested inside NATO, but other countries currently are saying, if we are going to walk with the European Union members of the NATO, we are going to get a smack on the nose from Russia. And with accepting and protecting Georgia, we are going to have this incentive that the countries that are going to walk with the West will be protected and will be stabilized. Thus, for more and more countries will be incentivized to actually go with us. Through this protection and alliance, regional stability will be reached through peace and confidence that connotations with the West will not be frowned upon and punished by Russia. And this will result in confidence throughout the region of the satellite states. This proves that this connection with us will bring benefits to both the European Union and the world and the satellite countries, because we will be reaching the stability that everyone desires. We will be reaching more connections between what is maybe the most important market, the most developing market currently, the market between Asia and the European Union. So this will be exactly beneficial to all the parties. So what have we've been telling you today? We have been telling you why it is good for Georgia to enter NATO, why it is good for the NATO to accept Georgia, and what this will happen in the region of the whole world. That this will happen with stability, that this will happen, help with the trade, and that this will help with the satellite countries no longer being afraid that the big bad Russian bear is going to smack them on the nose, but will accept the Western help from the NATO members, mostly from the European Union. Yes?
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 20 seconds.
I thank the second member of the proposition and call upon the second member of the opposition.
Just like the debater trying to get on the dodgeball team, Team Slovenia can talk the talk, but they can't quite catch the ball. And we see this in their plan. For the plan, we see that NATO needs an incentive to admit Georgia. And so it doesn't matter what the international community thinks. If NATO doesn't have an incentive, this motion is completely not feasible. My opponents have stated that NATO needs Georgia, that it would establish a military presence in Georgia and provide a door for NATO. However, it is very small. It's so overstretched with Iraq and combating forces in South Ossetia that it isn't able to properly dispense their forces to other nations. It wouldn't be able to provide big help to NATO currently. Also, as my teammate brought up in a point of information, other countries have shown no interest in joining NATO other than Georgia. Other countries that are so scared of Russia and would like this Western help have shown no interest whatsoever in joining NATO. So this would not create more allies. And my opponents have also said that with more members of NATO, we would automatically have more peace. However, NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A treaty is a body against other people, to protect militarily against other people. So we still have a conflict. Also, the bigger a body is, the more quarrels we have, or more possibility for quarrels we have among the members of this body. And my opponents have also said that there are US troops in Georgia, and just because there are US troops in Georgia now, it will prevent Russia from blowing up and prevent Russia from being so angry. However, those troops in Russia now are there only to deliver emergency aid. They are there to facilitate food, water, and shelter being delivered to these in crisis.
Yes, that is exactly why we're saying that we need a NATO presence there to actually protect the Georgians.
You brought up the US troops in Georgia in order to combat our point that Russia was going to start a Cold War. However, they are there to deliver emergency aid. And if the NATO were to bring a whole military base, if they were to have all the military arsenal, all the bombs potentially, all the missiles that come with NATO, all the missiles that come with a military base, then it would have much more of a reaction from Russia. So that brings me to backing my opposition case today. We have told you from the beginning that we don't want to poke a grumpy bear. That this grumpy bear might be so enraged that it'll try to eat out South Ossetia. That it'll try to reclaim it for its own and reclaim all its land around Georgia. We've also told you that this is a one-way street. That South Ossetia is already so poor in its resources, that they're already so spread out across the troops in Iraq, across this infrastructure that's currently being very damaged by the war in South Ossetia, that they wouldn't be able to help NATO, that NATO has no incentive to add them as a member. And so now, this brings me to my third point, that NATO wants to avoid any unstable allies, that these allies wouldn't be helpful at all. Currently, there is a separatist group in South Ossetia that wants to leave Georgia and become part of Russia. Russia is advocating these separatists. However, Georgia wants to keep South Ossetia as part of their own country. This has caused a war and has made this country very unstable. It's caused massive infrastructural damage and injured thousands of people. This is not an ally that NATO wants to have in their membership. This would not be very beneficial for them. And this isn't an isolated instance. This has happened before. In August 1993, the UN had to send a peacekeeping mission to stabilize NATO. Yes.
So basically what you're saying is that because it might not be beneficial, we're gonna let thousands of people die in Georgia.
No, I'm saying because it definitely isn't beneficial. Because it would harm the NATO treaty. NATO does not care about people dying. NATO only wants to better its treaty, to better the military organization. And our motion set before us today is that this House would admit Georgia to NATO. We have to look at the feasibility of this. We have to look at if it's going to be possible or not. And if NATO does not care if these thousands are dying, they only care if it'll be a military asset to them. And so back to my point, that this wasn't an isolated instance. Georgia itself has never been very stable, as we saw in August 1993 when the UN had to send a peacekeeping mission there to stabilize it. Indeed, it's a satellite state that only gained nationhood after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. It has never proved itself as an ally. It never proved itself as a military asset so far. And its very presence, its very being near Russia, would enrage Russia if NATO were to have a military presence there. It is simply not feasible that NATO would admit Georgia in the first place, as it has no incentive to do so. And so, as NATO does not need Georgia, as it simply would not be benefited at all by it, we would like to oppose a motion to admit Georgia to NATO. And also, I would like to bring up my opponent's case that the international community condemned action, but they didn't have the power to do something, to help these people who were suffering from Russia's invasion. However, NATO does not care about this, as I've stated many times before. NATO only cares about what will help them. And so, just like Georgia, the dodgeball team with the debater will always lose. The dodgeball team with the debater is not a very good team. It will drop the ball. It will just lose this debate. So, thank you very much.
Speaker spoke for 7 minutes and 44 seconds.
I thank the second member of the opposition, called upon the third member of the proposition.
it seems to be getting rather trendy to start speeches concerning NATO and Georgia with a dodgeball team example. And I'm going to do something different right now. I'm going to actually talk about NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was established in 1949. Yes, its primary role was to hold a counterbalance to the Warsaw Pact. Although after the dissolution of the pact, we believe and we have seen that NATO has taken on a totally different role. The United Nations have often called NATO to come as a force that will work in the name of the United Nations. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has expanded far beyond the North Atlantic. It includes states such as Slovenia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Turkey, and those countries have nothing to do with the North Atlantic. And simply, NATO being called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the fact that it didn't change its name from 1949 does not serve as an argument for team opposition to prove that it has to do something it really doesn't have to. Now, what are we going to talk about in my speech? We're going to ask ourselves 3 questions. First one, will NATO do it? Will NATO admit Georgia into its own forces? Second, is it worth it? And third one, will it work? Now, firstly, let's talk about whether NATO will do it. We've already discussed the changed function of NATO. The second thing the opposition would want you to believe in is that our first and third argument have nothing to do with this debate because NATO countries don't care about what's happening in Georgia and what's happening all around the world. Now, if you're willing to buy into the opposition's point that all of the NATO countries, all of the countries which are also members of the European Union, do not care about what the situation is in Georgia, how their economy is doing, how the conflict is progressing, no thank you, then follow that argument. We're not prepared to buy into that logic. If you're prepared to believe that each and every NATO member only cares about what's happening inside the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and not how accepting another member would stabilize world peace, world politics, then yes, buy into that argument. But we on Team Government believe that each and every country cares about the rest of the political issues that concern the rest of the world. Now, from this point on, we believe that NATO will do it. Exactly because our whole argument, our second argument, was focusing on the incentive that NATO has, the direct incentives, why NATO needs Georgia. Now, what has the opposition answered to that point? They say Georgia is a small country. Hello, so is Slovenia. Georgia has a small number of troops. Slovenia has about 5 times less soldiers than Georgia has, and even if all of the Georgian soldiers are spread out, not mentioning the fact that they're spread out on a mission that includes NATO forces in Iraq, we still believe it provides more than enough truth, and we've talked about the strategic position Georgia holds, which was never refuted by team opposition. Now, we believe that this argument still stands, and NATO has got more than enough incentive to admit Georgia into its own forces. Yes?
We've specifically stated that NATO knows that there is that strategic position. However, if we go into that strategic position, Russia will be further angered.
Okay, great. This brings me to our second point. Our second question, is it worth it? Now, the opposition will want you to believe that each and every time we make Russia mad, we're facing a second world war and a potential nuclear crisis. Now, one, we're not buying into that argument. The second thing they would have to prove this is the fact that we admit Georgia into NATO, sending our troops there, would immediately result in Russia gathering its own allies around itself, forming another pact, stating clearly that it doesn't want anything to do with the countries inside NATO and issuing another Cold War. They have not even reached that point because the only thing they have been able to state is that you don't poke a grumpy bear. Well, honorable panel of judges, we're not dealing with animals here. We're dealing with Russia, which was extremely concerned by the anti-missile shield set up in Eastern Europe by the United States of America, yet we didn't face another Cold War. We've seen Russia seeing how other countries which are not part of the which weren't part of the North Atlantic Treaty are getting admitted into NATO, yet we didn't see another Cold War. We see a former, practically Soviet, socialist country, Socialist Republic Slovenia, being accepted into NATO, yet Russia did not go berserk and start another Cold War. This argument simply has no ground to stand on. Now, they believe that simply because other countries have not yet clearly stated, hey guys, we want into NATO, that means that no other country will do so in the future. This argument doesn't prove that. Simply because until now, without the North Atlantic Treaties Organizations present in Asia, in Central Asia, no country has said it wants to be part of it. We believe that this is an inadequate response to our argument that we will gain more allies, because we believe that NATO, that the forces of the European Union and of other countries such as Canada, Iceland, Norway, will provide a certain amount of stability. We have to take in consideration that countries do not only operate on a military alliance, but as much contact countries have with another, we have a much greater possibility of developing an economic alliance, an economic development, an economic alliance between those two countries. Because we believe that each and every country in this planet realizes the fact that countries within NATO have not gone to war, and most probably, or we're willing to say, will not go as long as they are part of that organization. The second thing, that as much contact that they can have with another country on a peaceful level, it will only bring them good. That is why we believe it is worth it. Now the last question, will it work? We've got a couple of objections here. One of these objections is we're going to start another Cold War. I've already dealt with this one. The second thing we've already claimed is that the United States of America already have forces there to deliver emergency. Yet we have not seen any harsh reaction by Russia considering those forces in Georgia. Yes?
These U.S. troops are not military. They're simply to deliver food, water, and
Yes.
shelter.
They're
It's
simply to
different.
deliver food, water, and shelter. And that is why the CNN report on the U.S. military action always includes pictures and videos of tanks firing bombs, guys wearing guns, dressed in clothes that look like plants. That is why we deem it that the United States of America do hold a military presence in Georgia. Now, the last thing we want to talk about is actually our third argument, or actually to sum up all of our three arguments. In our first argument, we've talked about how Georgia needs NATO, how this will solve the problem there in Georgia, because let's face it, under international law, Georgia was invaded, period. Under the North Atlantic treaties, we know that those countries that are in NATO have the right to protect their own members from outside invasion. And when Georgia is accepted into NATO, other members will do that. And we believe that when we have the United States of America, Canada, practically the whole European Union, some countries that are not facing the European Union, even Turkey, all on one side, that Russia will most likely be deterred than to enter an armed conflict with such a great mass of forces. We believe it will work. We believe NATO has incentive, NATO needs Georgia, Georgia needs NATO, and the world needs this alliance. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 10 seconds.
I thank the third member of the proposition and call upon the third member of the opposition.
I would like to return to the dodgeball analogy that my opponents are so against, because unfortunately in middle school I was that scrawny debater who never got picked for the dodgeball team. And as much as the proposition can say that we can provide a helping hand, that all those cool jocks would tell me that you're cool anyway, it didn't happen. And so we're stuck on the side of the opposition where NATO does not have personal incentive to accept and admit Georgia into its membership. There are three essential questions that come before us today in this debate. The first is, what is NATO's role? The second is, will NATO be able to face Russia? And the third is, can Georgia help NATO? So moving on to the first point. What is NATO's role? We have clearly said countries in NATO, countries provide resources for other members when those other members are in strife. Now, when countries cannot provide for other countries, when they don't have the resources, they should not be a part of NATO, as they are not fulfilling the role. sometimes they take on projects. Our proposition said that sometimes they take on projects for the United Nations. And that's true. Sometimes they do take on projects. However, they don't admit every single country that they deliver the project to. Because membership is a permanent thing. Membership is bigger than just a simple project that is administered by the United Nations. Thus, even though NATO can administer projects through the United Nations, that doesn't mean that it should accept everyone as a member. So next they talk about, or the next point rather, is will NATO be able to face Russia? The proposition believes that Georgia is not strong enough and that NATO should intervene. However, what we are trying to say on the opposition is that when NATO intervenes, it will simply anger Russia even more. The proposition has stated, we haven't seen anything yet. We haven't seen a second Cold War from Russia. They cited the anti-missile shields and said how it angered Russia, but nothing happened. And we agree that the anti-missile shields did anger Russia. And although nothing has happened yet, it doesn't mean that it won't happen. Because every single step we take towards angering Russia is another chance that we get of them starting the chance of a Cold War. No thank you. We need to remember that although we haven't seen anything from Russia yet, that doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future. We need to see that every single threat that we make, every single time that we anger Russia, who has been trying to prove themselves to the rest of the world, we are threatening our own safety, yes.
We have done this time and time again, yet you have not proven how this exactly will result in the
Okay,
second
they
Cold
keep,
War.
thank you. They keep saying that we've done this time and time again, nothing has happened. They keep saying we continue to do this. However, as we continue to say all of these steps, if you haven't noticed, if you haven't read the news, Russia continues to get more and more angry. We're wondering, when is the tipping point? I would prefer not to anger Russia even more if we can avoid a Cold War. We can't predict the future, and that could happen. No thank you. What we're saying is that as we continue to anger Russia, actions will be taken by that country. We said that Russia is very much against NATO. Russia is trying to prove itself in the world. And thus it is important to realize that Russia is getting angered every single day. No thank you. The final question brought before us is, can Georgia help NATO? And this is the fundamental question that we bring to you, because as we've been saying throughout our entire case, all that matters is the incentives for NATO, because NATO is the only one who can say who gets to join NATO. No thank you. Our opponents have said that more allies are good, that the more allies you have, the less war, the more stability. However, ladies and gentlemen, if this was the case, I'm pretty sure by now NATO would have accepted the entire world into its organization. What we need to see is that more allies does not necessarily mean more stability or less war. As my colleague Julia pointed out in her case, when we have unstable allies joining us, it creates more problems. When there are wars going on within the countries, as we take them in, that's one more war that we have to fight, that we are committed to fighting. No thank you. And while we can take on projects, we are not ready to commit permanent membership to each and every one of the countries in the world. And the proposition continue to say that this will create more stability. However, they haven't shown how. They haven't shown why more allies equals greater stability, equals less war. They haven't made the link, ladies and gentlemen.
Sir.
And we can show you exactly why that isn't true. No thank you. Also, they say that we have strategic positioning, that we are in a good position, that Georgia is in a good position, that we can fight France, that we can fight Russia, that it's in a strategic position for NATO to have a base. However, we would like to point out, again, the problems with fighting Russia are endless. On top of this, we'd like to point out that we're not just going to create bases everywhere because there are strategic positions. No, yeah, sure.
So you are accepting a Russian dictator over the United States of America and the European Union?
What we're saying is that if NATO interjects, if NATO tries to indict and dig Georgia into membership right now at this point that it's in, first of all, it would create even more instability, and that now Russia has an incentive. Russia is now angered at the entire world. If you think things are bad now, wait until what happens later. No, thank you. So what we need to look at is that essentially Georgia cannot help NATO because strategic positioning is not a valid reason. We also would like to point out that Poland is a part of NATO. There are other countries in the area that are already parts of NATO, so strategic positioning is not necessarily what we need to think about. We need to think about the instability already in the country. We need to think about the problems already in the country before we bring them up. So looking back at our own pace, what we've stated is that we need to avoid a Cold War, the second. Because every single step that we take, every single threat that we make towards Russia is another chance of them starting another Cold War. It's another attack on their integrity as Russia tries to prove itself to the rest of the world. Then we say that we need to avoid a one-way street, because in this situation, ladies and gentlemen, Georgia cannot provide for the rest of NATO, as we've proven. Georgia cannot supply the military or the resources that is necessary when another member state is in strife. Finally, we need to avoid unstable allies. And this is crucial, and this directly takes out our opponents when they say that Georgia can help NATO, and that all allies are good, because when they're unstable, you can't say that unstable allies are good for any organization. And so we need to avoid impractical actions by denying Georgian admission. We need to make sure, if I was the captain of the dodgeball team, I wouldn't choose me either. And for all these reasons, I am proud to oppose the resolution. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 12 seconds.
I thank the third member of the opposition and call upon whomever it is that's going to deliver the reply speech for the opposition to now deliver it.
Ladies and gentlemen, to clarify the debate round, we're going to step away from the dodgeball game for a second. Because, ladies and gentlemen, obviously, world politics are much more serious than a dodgeball game. The effects of picking the wrong player in the real world don't result in losing the game, but in fact can result in the loss of life, the loss of sovereignty, and the loss of pride. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's look aside opposition and the main points of today's debate round. The first is the question of, is it in NATO's best incentive to admit Georgia? So let's look to that question now. Team Proposition would have you believe that it is in the best interest of NATO. The reasons that they give you, however, is that we're establishing a presence. And in fact, side opposition has shown you that this isn't a presence that we necessarily want. Because in fact, ladies and gentlemen, if you put a military presence on the border of a nation state who has traditionally been your enemy, that enemy tends to get angry. That enemy tends to remember the times when NATO was in fact a Cold War entity. The times when NATO was directly against Russia. So ladies and gentlemen, Georgia is not a strategic position, as Team Proposition would have you believe, but is in fact a dangerous position. But let's look to the second point that they tell you. They say that we're actually going to gain more allies. And ladies and gentlemen, there's simply no reason to believe that's true. Because if you have read the news, you would realize that Georgia is the only nation state from that area that has even expressed any interest in being involved in NATO. And they said it themselves. These nations simply don't care to be part of the West, nor do they care to be part of Russia. So in fact, if they don't care about being part of the West, why do they care about being part of NATO? Proposition has not answered that question for you today. So it seems pretty clear, based solely on the line of argumentation from Proposition, that NATO has no incentive to allow Georgia to be admitted into NATO. But even then, let's look to the opposition and the points that we tell you to answer this question. We have shown, simply, that NATO would not be benefited by introducing Georgia into the treaty. Because in fact, ladies and gentlemen, Georgia is an unstable region. You don't want an ally that you have to come bailing out every 10 years, because in fact, ladies and gentlemen, that seems to be the trend. In 1993, we see the UN going in with peacekeeping forces. In 2008, we see the invasion of the Russian troops. So ladies and gentlemen, why do we want a nation that we would only have to bail out continuously to be on our side? Because, ladies and gentlemen, you don't pick losing members to be on your team. But then let's look to the second question of today's debate round. Is it worth it? This is a question the team proposition asks. But the sad thing is that they don't even answer their own question. Let's look to the impacts of allowing Georgia to be in NATO. Team proposition would get up and make fun of the Cold War, which is a little bit ironic considering the problems that happened in the Cold War that they're simply trying to assume won't happen again. But ladies and gentlemen, we've already seen the tension can exist between the West, especially between the United States and between Russia. And there's no reason to believe that this won't happen again. There's all of the indicating signs. Russia is reacting very strongly to the fact of the US missile defense system in Poland. Russia simply has removed any Western culture from its borders. So ladies and gentlemen, let's not make fun of the Cold War, because let's remember that it was a reality and it can be a reality again. So, just in case you thought I wasn't going to remember, we'll go back to the dodgeball team. Who do you pick for your team? Well, you avoid the Cold War, you avoid the one-way street, and you avoid unstable allies. But ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, you're the captain, so you decide.
Speaker spoke for 3 minutes and 58 seconds.
I thank the member for her speech and call upon the proposition to deliver their final reply.
I urge you all to take a journey with me, a journey to Georgia, and analyze this debate through the eyes of these Georgians. Because when we take a step back and look at the bigger picture of this debate, we see that there are two key issues: the acceptance issue and the angering Russia issue. So let's just analyze those two. Firstly, we have the admittance issue, where we have side opposition that's saying Georgia has nothing to offer us. Georgia is too small. It has far less troops than we need. And basically, what they're saying is that that is a good enough reason for us to not accept them. When we have 3 points to say about that. Firstly, we gave you the example that it is in NATO's interest because of the strategic position of Georgia itself. It is in NATO's interest because of the allies it could gain if Georgia would be employed in NATO. And thirdly, even if we concede that there is no reason for NATO to accept Georgia, no personal benefit for NATO to accept Georgia, we say that it should still do it. Why? Because when we have a nation such as Georgia cooperating with the West countless times, cooperating with NATO countless times, and we come to a point where Georgia is being invaded, where countless Georgian people are dying day after day because of Russian invasion, we say that that is reason enough. We say that that is reason to accept them to NATO and ensure stability to that region. And when we have side-up proposition saying that because they cooperated, because they're in trouble, and at the end of the day, because they have the strategic position and would allow us to actually further our alliances, we say on side proposition that NATO, it is in NATO's best interest to actually accept Georgia in NATO. And secondly, when we talk about angering Russia, we have side opposition saying we'll have another Cold War and Russia will be angry. Now, firstly, why should we care if Russia is angry? Side proposition today simply does not fear Russia. We are not willing to accept them dictating our international community what is right and what is wrong. We are not willing to dance when Russia says dance. We are not willing to sing when Russia says sing. Not when we have countless individuals, countless Georgians who are dying by their hand. And basically what side opposition today proved is simply the fact that Russians are a mad nation, are an angry nation, nothing more. While we have side proposition saying that that anger, that madness is not enough for us to not accept Georgia, is not enough for us to abandon those people when they were cooperative, when they were helping us. So basically, when we take a step back, we have side opposition and the NATO of side opposition that is saying, no, you're too small. We won't help you because we fear the big almighty Russia. We won't help you even if you helped us in the past. While we have side proposition, a NATO community that knows its responsibility, not to Georgia, but to humanity as a whole, knows its responsibility to act when it is needed. A NATO community that knows and does not fear empty threats of Russia, and a NATO community that is willing to save lives. A NATO community that is willing to accept Georgia, not because it might be beneficial for us, but because it will be beneficial for them. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 5 seconds.
Somebody's knocking.
Great job.
I